Okay, thanks for coming. So this is a focus talk. The theme of focus, of course, is the word. And so we're going to talk about the problems of the word. And I had a student come to my office not that long ago, and he was talking to me about God. And this is going to sound silly when I said it, and he was aware that it sounded silly as well. But he's like, sometimes I think about what it would mean to be God in terms of how much power you have. And the student's trying to sort of grasp what that would mean. And so he's like, I don't know how to describe that. And so he's like, I can't use the word awesome, right? And he was aware of that. The word awesome is sort of pithed of its meaning. Awesome is just a placeholder for when you're excited. Powerful doesn't do it. He's saying, I don't know how to put into words these sort of flashes, these epiphanies of what it would mean to actually be the creator of the universe. And so I introduced him to a word. And that word's pronounced oscillate. And it's originally from the Syriac, which is a Semitic language. And eventually it sort of comes to the West through Latin speakers when they interact with Syriac. And so what I put up here, it means a powerful ruler. So an oscillate is a person who has a lot of power. But it suggests that they're withholding the power mercifully. And I explained this to him and gave the metaphor that I didn't invent, that other writers had invented, which was, it's sort of best described as the great leader who, if you have a criminal who is going to be put to death, he's always sort of withholding that power. Even though he has the right to put this criminal to death, he chooses not to do it. And so I described this word oscillate, and the student's like, yeah, I mean, that's sort of getting at what I'm talking about. Actually, that's an oscillate. I made that up. Oscillate. Some of you are taking notes because you have to turn something in. You better scratch all that out. An oscillate, that's an oscillate. It has nothing to do with power. It has nothing to do with God. It has nothing to do with religion. It's a small cat from the Americas. The word comes from Nahuatl, which was an Aztec language. The whole story is a lie, just to be clear. I didn't tell the student about oscillate and have him walk away just so he could say something to her, like, tell me about an oscillate. And we're like, dude, an oscillate's a cat. That professor. No, the whole thing's a lie. Students don't come to my office, and they certainly don't talk to me about God. They know better. Because I just lie. That's what I do. So what? Suckers. All right, so I did sort of want to take you for a ride at the beginning of this presentation. And maybe some of you, I hope a few of you are like, wait, I swear an oscillate's a cat. But he's a professor, so I'll just write that down. All right, so what's the point of doing this? Part of it is to show that your all's language is limited. That you aren't in control of your language. You are not the author of your own language. You receive your language from others. You receive your language from culture. You don't do anything yourself. And maybe you receive it from a professor and he's lying to you, and you go your entire life until the day you die thinking that oscillate is this great word to describe God, and then I sneak up on your deathbed and whisper to you, excuse me, grandkids, excuse me, oscillate's a cat from the Americas. What would that mean? What would that actually mean to you? Would it change anything? Would it change what God was to you? Is having a certain word a magic formula to getting closer to the truth? It doesn't matter what words you use. Language is limited. And Rob Moore-Junemanville spoke at Chapel today. And I told him this, and I'll tell you that too. It's one of the best talks I've ever heard at Spring Harbor. So if you didn't go to it, I think they'll put it streamed something. Go find it. And he was speaking about this very thing at the beginning of the talk. Language is limited. And it's not limited because you're 19 years old and you don't know big words, or you don't know what you don't know, so that I can introduce a cat to you and you can think that that's God. That has nothing to do with the limits of language. It's just the limit of language itself. That you can't describe everything. As powerful as language is, and it is very powerful, it shapes your culture. It shapes who you are. It is still limited. And you might believe that your love is beyond language. And it might be. Your love might be beyond language. Or you might think about past experiences you've had. And you say, that is beyond language. Not just I can't express it, but language can't express it. You should still try to express it. That's what we call poetry. To express the inexpressible, or at least try to. But the one thing that we could say must be beyond language is God, the uncreated, the one thing outside of the created order. So what does it mean to talk about God, then, if we have to keep using words that are by nature limited? Would you really be any worse off by just using oscillate your entire life than if you said powerful? Are either one of those getting closer to the essence of the one uncreated being in this universe? Christianity has always thought about this idea. It has always been with us. That we are limited by our language. God is not. So what the heck are we supposed to do? And this is what we mean by sort of the prison house of language. That we can't get out of it. But there are things outside of those bars of language. And even if you're not religious, you still know this. That there are things that you can't describe, but you say are nevertheless true, or nevertheless real. Because you would be taking a real philosophical stand if you said only that which is expressible, either by myself or other people, is real. And there are philosophies that might maintain that, but Christianity has never been one of them. In fact, God would be so much outside of the prison house of our language that we can't even say he's unnameable. Because guess what the word unnameable is? That's within our language too. And a sort of paralysis comes. How do I talk about that which is uncreated? How do I talk about that which is incomprehensible? And even when I say I won't talk about it, so I'll say what God isn't, I'm still using language. What the heck am I supposed to do? And again, this has been with us since the dawn of Christianity, even before Christianity. All right. So what we're talking about is apophatic mystical theology. Big words to make you sound really smart and religious. You don't have to know what they mean, just use them at the DC. The person next to you will be impressed, like, wow, smart and good looking. And then one thing leads, it's how I got my wife to marry me. Just talked about apophatic mystical theology a lot. She's like, if I marry you, will you shut up? And then I said, how apophatic, I will shut up. All right, so to sort of talk about apophatic mystical theology, let's sort of work backwards and start with theology. Sometimes we don't like to define words that we're already supposed to know. Defining theology, right? Theology, very simply, like the system of religious beliefs that you have. And it's going to be systematic in some kind of way. These are the doctrines. These are the dogmas. These are your creeds, whatever your creeds might be. This is a part of theology. Fair enough. No argument there. Well, what is mystical? Mystical is the actual encounter with God. And so it's really easy to pit these two against each other. And this is the inclination of many throughout history to pit these against each other. That the mystical is opposed to the person who sets down the doctrines. So you think about it in terms of like the dictionary definition of courage is your theology. Your experience of courage on the battlefield is the mystical experience. And you could theoretically, in your own faith, have a mystical experience staring at a car. What you're actually saying is, I'm actually having some kind of communion with the divine, versus theology, which is learning about the divine. And then what is apophatic? Apophatic is sort of one subset of this, sometimes called negative theology, or the via negativa, the negative way. And the best way to talk about apophatic is to pose it against its opposite, which is cataphatic. Okay? Cataphatic theology, making a positive statement. So, for instance, saying God is love is a cataphatic statement. There's nothing wrong with cataphatic. If you're taking notes or in any way listening to me, this is as important as anything else I say. That cataphatic and apophatic are not opponents on a playing field. Within our religion, they work together. It's just culturally, we sort of swing one way rather than the other. And we define our faith one way over the other. So cataphatic might be saying God is love. An apophatic approach would be saying, actually, God is love is a heretical statement. So God is hate? No. Because love is constricted. Love is within the prison house of our language. Love is however you're sort of understanding love. So when you say God is love, you have contained the uncontainable. You have expressed the inexpressible. You have comprehended the incomprehensible. So I should say, no. As soon as you start using words, you're back in the prison house of language. So cataphatic, naming God, right? King of kings, Lord of lords, Jehovah, Elohim, everything you want to say. And what's the apophatic response? I honestly don't know what to do on the right side because I can't use language. That's not actually apophaticism to use language. So I use brackets, but guess what brackets are doing? They're acting like a language for you. So now I'm just describing my existential crisis of I have to write something, even the brackets are something, I can't write nothing, but that's what you're supposed to do. Nothing. Not the word nothing. The word nothing is a part of your language. You've got to go outside of language. The greatest cataphatic move God ever makes is the incarnation. Right? Becomes man. So theophany or epiphany or the baptism of Christ as a cataphatic moment in time where Christ reveals God to us. The apophatic is always talking about we can't have everything revealed to us because we are locked as a limited created being. I can't express to you God. Jesus Christ in a cataphatic moment enters into time, enters into history, enters into language. So the best I can do to sort of oppose this is Exodus 20:21. And I'm sure you've all got it memorized. Some of you tattooed across your stomach. Tell me that's true. Just one. This is the moment in Exodus when Moses goes up the mountain. And he says, the people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. God not as light, but God as darkness. That thing which is beyond, that great abyss. Gregory of Nyssa. And Gregory of Nyssa, who got mentioned in Rob's talk, I'll mention him again. Gregory of Nyssa, one of your Cappadocian fathers, he's an architect to the Nicene Creed in its fullest form. He's a guy who actually, in terms of showing that mysticism and theology are not opposed to each other, Gregory of Nyssa, 4th century bishop of Nyssa, now a saint, helps write the final creed, the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. At the same time, he writes one of the most influential books of mysticism in all of Christianity, The Life of Moses. Same guy. These things are not opposed to each other. And this is what Gregory of Nyssa says about this moment in Exodus 20:21, which is defined by darkness. Since Moses was alone, by having been stripped, as it were, of the people's fear, he boldly approached the very darkness itself and entered the invisible things where he was no longer seen by those watching. After he entered the inner sanctuary of the divine mystical doctrine, there, while not being seen, he was in company with the invisible. He teaches, I think, by the things he did, that the one who is going to associate intimately with God must go beyond all that is visible, and lifting up his own mind as to a mountaintop, to the invisible and incomprehensible, believe that the divine is there where the understanding does not reach. The idea being, hey, why can't, I want a narration of what it's like for Moses to go into that darkness. And Nissa saying, you can't narrate it. It's beyond language. You just simply can't. Well, then I can't know it. No. You know it through a mystical experience. You don't know it by learning about it, because it is beyond language. All right, Ephesians 3:19. And to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. 1 Corinthians 13:12. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror, then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. 1 Timothy 6:16. Who alone, God alone, is immortal, and who lives in unapproachable light, whom no one has seen or can see. Whoa. Come on, Paul, we have Jesus Christ. What are you talking about here? It's another contradiction in the Bible. Another contradiction. 90% of the religious arguments you get into with non-religious people, you're losing, not because of anything besides, you're limited too. You don't stand for Christianity. Christianity can't answer some of the things that your really smart friend on Reddit is asking you. Were you able to listen to the verses while I was... Does it sound like, sounds like a hippie thing, right? It sounds like, man, let's just get to the Bible. Let's just get to the stuff that matters. Stop doing this apophatic stuff. I didn't learn that in Sunday school. It's fine not to learn in Sunday school. I don't think Sunday school is probably the place for it. But it's nothing new. To have forgotten it, to not know it, is more new than apophaticism itself. Some quotes from some important texts in Christian mysticism. Pseudo-Dionysius, mystical theology. The fact is that the more we take flight upward, the more our words are confined to the ideas we are capable of forming. So that now as we plunge into that darkness which is beyond intellect, we shall find ourselves not simply running short of words, but actually speechless and unknowing. Because you don't learn this. You don't know it. It is the experience of having fallen in love, and that experience is now gone. Well, I had a communion with that person. I had a union with the person. I can't tell you about that in its fullness. And you'll find what's sort of odd in terms of metaphors is apophatic theology uses darkness all the time, and you're probably trained to think of darkness as a bad thing. But even the Bible sort of mixes its metaphors. The darkness is not always a bad thing as Moses walks into the darkness. Sometimes it is used as a metaphor for wickedness and whatnot, but not always, and certainly not in apophatic theology. Gregory of Nyssa again, Life of Moses. As the mind progresses and through an even ever greater and more perfect diligence comes to apprehend reality, as it approaches more nearly to contemplation, it sees more clearly what of the divine nature is uncontemplated, what is essentially uncontemplatable. Oh, I'm just going to go, if I went to prison, is this something, am I the only one, guys, who's just like deathly afraid of going to prison? You're just like, I don't know why I'm going to prison, but it's just like a fear, like, I don't go to prison. Like, I'll go to solitary confinement. That'll be better because I don't want anything to do with prison. I'll just contemplate God. All right, so you go sent to solitary confinement, you contemplate God for 25 years. What have you contemplated? What fraction of him have you seen around? Nyssa talks about Moses seeing the backside of God, and it's always a weird moment, right? You're like, he sees the backside of God. Oh man, I hope my atheist friends don't mention this. I don't know what to do with it. Just close that book and let's go back to the Gospels. Why the backside of God? Because of this very idea of apophatic theology. Because there must be an uncontemplatable part. Otherwise, who are you? You can contemplate the digestive system of crows. You cannot contemplate God in its fullness. Okay. Christ became human, and by becoming human allows us to participate in the divine life, and you all say check. Oh, I didn't mean that literally. But it's fine. Actually, why don't you go ahead and not... Wait. Okay, now that you started this, I'm going to finish it. Now you're going to keep reading that part, okay? We do not simply accept that we can only have a knowledge of God, but instead can have a union with him. That's pretty on cue. The essence of God is beyond comprehension. This is just, if you just thought, are we distinguishing from the energies of God, then come up here and do this presentation yourself. If you didn't think that, then stop reading. Of course, you can't stop reading and stop reading at the same time. So if you understand the theological difference between the energies of God and the essence of God, we can talk more about this later. And if you're also just like, I don't know what that's, I don't know, yeah, it's fine. It's fine. Just go back to your check lines. We are limited by language and intellect. Look, they're not going to appreciate it, but you should really, instead of saying to someone, I die for you, just be like, I will never get mad about you not doing the dishes. That's a much more important phrase to say for the health of a relationship than I die for you. Like, I died? What has your life been like for these first 19 years that you're always having to run around dying for people? I won't get mad at you when you become needy, right? That's a much more effective phrase. All right, so you theoretically believed all these statements, right? Christ became human, and we can participate in the divine essence, or in the divine life, because of the incarnation. And we can actually have some kind of union with him, not a full union. Essence of God is beyond comprehension. We are limited by language and intellect. Check, 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 check. Then how do we address this limit? Is our experience of God only as large as our intellectual capabilities? So if there's someone in here who has spent 15 years studying Christian theology, what does that actually mean? That they understand God better? Well, if you think that, then go to some seminary in which you don't agree with their theology and see if you still think that's true. And you almost certainly don't. I think about that with Jonathan Edwards all the time. I don't agree with a lot of what Jonathan Edwards would have said. But this guy spent like 12 hours a day just studying theology. Who am I to disagree with him? But I still do. Apophaticism is not a branch of theology, a chapter, an inevitable introduction of the incomprehensibility of God from which one passes unruffled to a doctrinal exposition in the usual terminology of human reason and philosophy in general. Apophaticism teaches us to see above all a negative meaning in the dogmas of the church. It forbids us, I can't stress this enough, it's great, this is Losky, it's perfect. It forbids us to follow natural ways of thought and to form concepts which would usurp the place of spiritual realities. For Christianity is not a philosophical school for speculating about abstract concepts, but is essentially a communion with the living God. This doesn't say that theology is unimportant, because you get into big trouble, I think, if you throw mysticism away and only have theology. And you get equally into big trouble if you throw away theology and you only have mysticism. Right? Like, oh, I went out to the tree and I felt God. No, you didn't. Well, I felt it. You can't tell me that I didn't. Right? Well, let's look at the historical tradition of the church. No, I don't do that. I just know what I feel. I'm a mystic. You get in trouble without both of these. You need both of them. But what apophaticism is talking about is this, and I'll read it again. It forbids us to follow natural ways of thought and to form concepts which would usurp the place of spiritual realities. The knowledge about God can't usurp the communion with God. That both mysticism and theology are pushing us to that very thing. The idea that Christ says, I'm the truth. We understand truth as a person and not as a series of bullet points. All right. So how do I do any of this, or should I just wear a plastic bracelet? So I just made a bracelet. I'm going to sell them. I haven't been using my notes. Now I got to find them. All right. Apophaticism is not an agnosticism toward learning. It is not an excuse for laziness. Like, well, I don't have to do anything. Oh, that was hard, so I just won't do it. There, I'm apophatic. First thing in terms of if you want to do apophaticism, and this is what all the mystics would tell you, is you must live the virtuous life. Because there's no encounter, no at least fuller encounter with the divine without the virtuous life coming first. This is not a way out of not sinning. That comes first. Let's pretend you get there, or I get there. It's not a study. It's not something you read. It's a shift of attitude. It's a change in your sort of existential understanding of your being and in terms of what God is. That I do not look for the God in the things of language entirely. I do not look for God entirely in the things that I can put into bullet points for a systematic theology. That there is more to him than that. And if that sounds really easy to you, good job, I guess. But whenever someone tells me something like that, it's like when they talk about forgiveness or repentance. It's like, oh yeah, I just forgave him. I don't think you did. If it was easy to forgive him, it either wasn't worth getting mad over in the first place, or you haven't really forgiven them. Forgiveness is very difficult. Repentance is very, very difficult. This change of attitude in terms of apophatic theology is very, very difficult. Hey, my wife and kids are here. I already read them your text. I'm in trouble when I get home. All right. It's a way of living. It's not a new prayer to say. It's not a new book to read. It's a way of living. It's a shift of attitude that you can't know. And in that lack of knowing, in that inability to know, in that prison house you are stuck in, there is a path into an even fuller communion with God. Okay. I'm going to talk to you about mysticism and rationalism real quick. And if you just want to read about the oscillate, because I lied to you about the oscillate before, then by all means, just go ahead and read about the oscillate. Okay. So what happens is, as our Western culture develops, we care more and more about rationalism. We care more and more about doctrine and dogma. And the mystics become fringe characters. And this is not just an Orthodox person up here talking about those naughty Protestants and Catholics. This happens in the East as well. Peter the Great, who wants to be really European, just says, if you're acting like a holy fool in Russia, we will arrest you. No more monasteries are to be made. We're done with monasteries. All of our sort of cultural heritage is pushing away from mysticism. And what it pushes towards is rationalism. It pushes toward the Enlightenment. And mysticism doesn't really work well with Enlightenment values because it's not testable. It's not repeatable. It's not verifiable. It doesn't hold up well to empirical study. And it gets pushed out, and it gets pushed out, and it gets pushed out. And what our real God starts to become is the rules of science. And so religion is as good as it follows the rules of science. So do you believe in your religion? Well, then you ask yourself, do I know the doctrines of my faith? And that's the extent of it. Is my faith strong? Did I beat an atheist in an argument? Then my faith is strong. If something is real, then it must be verifiable, and I can be certain about it. This stuff of uncertainty, this stuff of passing experience, this stuff of communion, no. And it becomes devalued. And so right now, apophaticism and mysticism sounds really hippie liberal thinking, and you want to get back to your conservative roots. But all of us Christians in here have these same mystical roots as well as roots within the creeds. And so what happens is we get more and more rational. We value that more and more and value that more and more. Until the 20th century, when all the cracks that had been forming for several hundred years really break apart. That confidence in reason breaks apart. That confidence in our progress breaks apart. That confidence in our ability to prove things breaks apart. And what we have in its place is the postmodern. Let's find the postmodern for you. As an adjective, it adequately explains everything you don't like about contemporary culture when you place it in front of the word world. This postmodern world of ours. Did you hear what happened in the news? Postmodern world, I tell you what. Or you can use it as a noun, as a name for anything you find weird or unsettling. Do you like that art? Postmodernism. That doesn't, I'm asking you, do you like it? It's postmodernism. This is weird. I don't know what it is. Basic definition of postmodernism. Incredulity toward meta-narratives. See, it's postmodern because I define it and you still have no idea what I'm talking about. What does that mean, incredulity to meta-narratives? Incredulity means disbelief. Credo, I believe. Creo in Spanish, right? Creer, you know this stuff. So incredulity is disbelief. To meta-narrative. What's a meta-narrative? A meta-narrative is something, a narrative that sort of explains all the other narratives. It explains our Western culture. For instance, a meta-narrative like, we are continuing to progress through science and reason. And as long as science and reason keep moving, we keep progressing. Yay. That's a meta-narrative. And postmodernism comes along and says, I doubt that. And that's the sort of status of the postmodern. It's always doubting. It's not making claims. It's always skeptical. It's always ironic. It's always distant. Because it doesn't trust any of these things. The idea of any kind of hierarchy. It is rare that at your age you would say, I believe this simply because a person in my life who was above me said so. And I will admit that the only reason I believe that is because the person who was higher than me says so. Almost none of you would admit to that. Even if it's subconsciously true, you wouldn't admit to that. You would say like, oh, I came to these thoughts myself. No, none of you would proudly say, my pastor said it, therefore I believe it. And you might not think that's a bad thing, but we certainly expect that in postmodernism as hierarchies start to break down. You don't believe in hierarchies as much. And look, that's not a bad thing. For those of you who had me in class and I've talked about postmodernism before, you know I'm not some enemy seeing postmodern as something that you have to run from. Look, the civil rights come within postmodernism. Feminism helps sort of flourish within postmodernism. The end of colonialism happens in postmodernism. And these are good things, breakdown of hierarchies. But it's more of this sort of incredulity to meta-narratives. I can't really trust this stuff. So you keep asking question marks, right? Because you're not really confident with saying it. In the same way that I've asked you, is the church you go to true? Don't ask me that. I mean, no, is the church you go to, is their doctrine right and is mine wrong? I don't want to. I just think it's all sort of floating out there, and it's just, we're all pieces to a puzzle, and I don't like the question, please don't make me answer. Okay? This is probably not terribly unfamiliar to you. You'd expect it. All right, enough being cutesy. The drill sergeant has had enough of this and is here to give you answers. What is postmodernism? It is a cultural sensibility that devalues hierarchy, linearity, progress, rationality, and certainty. It's the temperature of the water you're in. You swim in it every day. You can't say, I'm not postmodern. Yes, you are, and so am I. It's the culture we live in. You will get on your phone and talk to someone, and you're on FaceTime or something. It will go up to space, and it will go across the world, and you'll be like, yep, that's normal. You will get on an airplane for your cross-cultural trip and bundled up, and then you will go to a tropic location and immediately have to disperse the jacket. And you will think, yep, that's normal. It's a total lack of linearity. You can just sort of put these two things together. I'm a little bit Presbyterian. I'm a little bit Catholic. I just sort of mesh it all together and make my own. Yeah, you're fine with that. Because you don't care about that which is linear. Or at least not fully, or at least not as much as maybe your great-grandparents would have. Why is it like that? And there's lots of reasons, but here's a really big one, World War II. And why World War II? Because of two things, the atomic bomb and the Holocaust. Because nothing could say to our culture, progress is not happening, than that which is so wicked that it is actually non-narratable. You cannot narrate the Holocaust. If you read any Holocaust literature, they talk about this philosophically all the time. It's beyond narration. It's beyond comprehension what happened. So no, I don't believe in progress as the postmodern person, because science, technology, all these things help lead us to this. Being certain about things helped lead us to this. If you have a youth pastor or a chapel speaker bemoaning a postmodern world, the thing you should say is, well, why wouldn't we have a postmodern world given what happened halfway through the 20th century? What would have been the right response? Especially if you had, World War I contributed to this as well. Our own Dr. Mark Crow writes a book about this, or has written a book about this, of the German churches encouraging World War I, and the soldiers coming back and being like, what happened to that hierarchy? They just sent us to hell and are still telling us it's a good thing. These things don't work together. I can't trust these hierarchies anymore. So it happens first in Europe, and then it eventually comes to us. Sort of especially in the 1960s in the United States, it comes to us. If you wanted me to prove that the postmodern is not just an idea, but a reality, Consider your great-grandparents and ask yourself if they would embrace your technology, your multiplicities of categories, your cherry-picking of traditions, and your irony. You all like, myself included, right? Like ironic distance. You wear things that you don't know if you actually like or not, because you're so steeped in irony that you don't even know that which is pure and that which is impure. You're like, is this? Yeah, I guess it's, yeah. You get your news from The Daily Show. I have nothing against The Daily Show. I think it's great. You get your news from a comedy show, though. And you actually get more accurate news from The Daily Show than other news channels. And so you're like, well, what is ironic? What's not? I don't know. You just swim in it. You swim in it. Think about human sexuality here for a second. And the blowing up of categories that's happened since post-World War II. All kinds of categories. I'm really not here to say good or bad about any of those categories. But before, you would have had two. Yes, we like our certainty. And now, well, it's hard to say. Just sort of everything. I'm just going to get back on my cell phone and go to space. So don't worry about it. I don't know. I just needed to put something on the screen for this one. Because you're like, wait, what happened to mysticism? I swear he just cut his talk in half. I didn't, but if I did, wouldn't that be postmodern of me? Think about it, everybody. What postmodernism, why it's incredulous toward meta-narratives, why it's sort of always ironically distant and not comfortable with making claims of certainty, is because it's issues of access. What access do I have to know that it's certain? Because guess what postmodern is very keen on pointing out? You're trapped in a prison house of language. That term, prison house of language, comes out of the postmodern era. A lot of writers have sort of picked up on it. It's not a Christian term. So you're stuck in the prison house of language. So if you try and get out of it, what are you going to? So postmodernism and all the different philosophies of postmodernism very rarely is like, it just doesn't exist that if someone said, I'm postmodern, therefore I don't believe in God. That doesn't even make any sense. That'd be like saying, I live in a 3-story house, therefore I don't believe in God. Postmodernism is just the condition. It's the air we breathe. It's the sensibility. And every sensibility can sort of help lead us to God, and every sensibility can help take us away from God. And within postmodernism, it's always an issue of access. You can't get out of that prison house of language. Now, we as Christians would say that's not true. But a postmodern philosopher like Jacques Derrida or Jean-Francois Lyotard would say, you can't get out of this. You're always stuck in it. So Derrida would be like, I'm not saying there's no God. That's not Derrida. I mean, Derrida is one of sort of the main postmodern philosophers. And he's not out to crush Christianity. What he's constantly pointing out is, I can't get out of this prison house of language, so if there is an absolute out there, I have no access to it. Because every time I try and get to it, guess what I'm using? Language. Oh, no, sir, I use the Bible. Yeah, Derrida said, that's language. I use sermons. That's language. That's language. You're always using language and you can't get out of it. It's this is an Escher painting of the Mobius strip. It's sort of a nice little mathematical paradox. You take a strip of paper, you make an infinity sign out of it, the ant crawls on one side only of the paper, and by never crossing sides, nevertheless walks on both sides of the paper. He's sort of stuck in that loop of going to one to the other, one to the other, one to the other, but can't get access outside. All those facts I told you about the oscillate halfway through were wrong. They've never gotten as north to Kentucky. That's not true. People didn't. There was no sitcom called Ozzie. I was really proud of the name of that sitcom, Ozzie and Me. If you want to storyboard that later, we can work something out. That could be a... No, they have the worst vision of all the wildcats? That's not true. They don't kill smaller cats for no discernible reason. The idea being, imagine me as your professor, sort of your access. And as long as you're sort of stuck in the loop of what language I give you, how would you ever actually know anything different than an oscillate? You'd be like, well, I'd go to another professor. All the professors are saying, it's all a big conspiracy. We're just lying to you about oscillates. It's a really weird conspiracy, but it's one we're dedicated to. These are all not true, but how would you get out of this? How would you find another way to learn about an oscillate if all you were stuck with my language and the language of other professors? You wouldn't. Oscillates would be real, they would have absolutely fine vision, but you would never have access to that. I actually found out that one of my favorite musicians is Graham Parsons. You guys don't know who Graham Parsons is because you don't listen to music that's older than you, but he's fantastic. You don't get anything else out of his presentation, listen to Graham Parsons. He actually had a pet oscillate. So did Salvador Dali. Wikipedia, tell you what, that's... Wikipedia is a great postmodern example. And you know why? Because you can jump everywhere. Everywhere within Wikipedia. You can add to Wikipedia. But guess what Wikipedia is not most of the time? It's not wrong. It's not like it's totally, I mean, don't go to it for religion or politics. But if you need to go to it for an oscillate, unless a Michigan professor just very recently changed all the oscillate information, it's probably going to be... They change it very quickly. Okay, so I'm trying to lead you to a point without mentioning it. This idea of access and something being beyond, that postmodern philosophers are always sort of keen on, how can I get beyond? So this is Derrida. This is tough, but stay with me. This more, this beyond, this hyper, obviously introduces an absolute heterogeneity in the order and in the modality of the possible. The possibility of the impossible, of the more impossible, that as such is also possible, more impossible than the impossible, marks an absolute interruption in the regime of the possible that nonetheless remains, if this can be said, in place. That's what it's like to read postmodern philosophy, by the way. I'll translate that by just reading to you from a Christian mystic. You are simple, talking about God. You are simple, whole, and you are many-faceted. And a mind is totally unable to understand the diversity of your glory and the splendor of your beauty. And so you are not anything, since you are above everything. You who are outside of all things, since you are God of all things, invisible, unapproachable, inapprehensible, and intangible, more impossible than the impossible. Because I can't say just the impossible, because guess what that is? A sign. It's another linguistic sign. Both this Christian mystic and Derrida are speaking at least the same direction. Not about the exact same thing, but the same direction. That's my son. Jean-Francois Lyotard, we can conceive the infinitely great, the infinitely powerful, but every presentation of an object destined to make visible this absolute greatness or power appears to us painfully inadequate. Those are ideas of which no presentation is possible. Therefore, they impart no knowledge about reality. So I can say God is love, and we can understand that to be theologically true, but what does that mean in the actual encounter of the uncreated other? St. Gregory Palamas, one sees not in a negative way, for one does see something, but in a manner superior to negation. For God is not only beyond knowledge, but also beyond unknowing. His revelation itself is also truly a mystery of a most divine and an extraordinary kind, since the divine manifestations, even if symbolic, remain unknowable by reason of their transcendence. You guys know, maybe a few of you know what the cloud of unknowing is. I was really proud of that cloud of... Anyway. Cloud of unknowing is a famous mystical text in Christianity. And I just like the idea, I am the cloud. Anyway. So when you think about postmodernism, you might think of like, oh, it's just relativism. No, that's not what it is. That's never what it was. That's just what someone who is mad about the state of the world just said everything is relative. But the similarities between these two, that both of them recognize a limit to our language. What the one on the right is not willing to do, because these philosophers come from their own theological bias. What they're not willing to do is talk about what is beyond. But the reason they're not willing to talk about what is beyond is actually for an honest reason, according to them. They're not trying to break down religion. They're simply saying, I can't know. The mystics would say, yes, we are stuck within the language, but you can get beyond language because of that mystical union. because of the actual experience of courage, not just learning about courage. You can actually be courageous. You can actually have communion with that which is outside of language. And for many of us, you're talking about the sacraments as part of that outside of language experience. In terms of the apophatic, one of the reasons I want to present this is to sort of speak about the nature of reality, both of us as well as God. And for me to immediately speak about the reality of God means I'm doing it wrong, because I can't. And it's not because I'm not a good enough poet, and it's not because I didn't read enough books. I simply can't. It is beyond. The God that you are hearing about, whether it be in classes, which would be fine, but God help you, within the culture war rhetoric that goes around, is not God. That's not God. If you drown in this rhetoric that many of you are drowning in, because your experience of religion is constantly going through culture war, sort of shallow thinking, what becomes of God is easily dismissed. That is not what Christianity has always understood. You are crippling yourself unknowingly, perhaps. I wanted to talk to you about this because of the place of the intellect. The intellect is good. The cataphatic is not bad. The cataphatic is saying God is love is not a bad thing. What the apophatic says about God is love, but to say God is love is heresy, both at the same time. Because we are speaking about that part of God which has made manifest to us through Christ, as well as that God which is beyond us, which is incomprehensible. The intellect can't do it. That doesn't mean the intellect doesn't participate, but the intellect can't do it. And to rest in that, to not be burdened by that, to not be burdened by you're always looking for that next thing that will help you believe in God, that next theological piece, that next argument you're waiting for, that next cataphatic response that will finally give you whatever peace you're looking for. That instead, these things are beyond the intellect. They are beyond language. And they might occur in a contemplative life that you have, or they might occur in things like the sacraments. They occur beyond language, not just within language. And I wanted to bring in the postmodern as well. I could have done this whole thing just on the apophatic, and we're obviously going 60 miles per hour when we should be going about 3 miles per hour. But I wanted to bring in the postmodern for a couple things, because first of all, there's no reason to be shaking your fist at the culture around you. That's not the problem. Every culture makes it hard to be a Christian. What culture are you imagining where it was really easy? Do not set postmodernism up to be some sort of enemy. That binary of Christian versus postmodern is inaccurate and silly and wasteful. And I wanted to say that we have common spaces. We have Jacques Derrida, for as much as he was not religious, you have a shared space with him. You need not constantly see enemies. Think about that as sort of a cataphatic way of understanding your religion. If I know my enemies, then I'll know what I am. If I know which philosophers are supposed to stay away from, then I'll know what's good. They're not Christian. I'm not trying to argue that. But we have commonality between them. And it's possible that they actually might help you. It's possible that in reading Derrida, he helps you understand God. The experience I had where I most felt like I came to a sensation of the otherness of God came when I read a book by an atheist science fiction writer. Olaf Stapleton wrote The Star Maker. And it's not a Christian book, and I wouldn't assume everybody has this experience when reading it. But it was powerful to me. And it's quite possible that I just limit myself to only the right cataphatic responses that are from my team, but instead say, no, it's possible to find these allies who are saying the exact same thing, but knowing full well what they don't offer as well, which is actually communion with the divine. we'll stop there. We have a few minutes for questions. And I don't know if I can answer your questions, and I don't know if you can articulate your questions, but we'll do our best. We'll do our best if you've got them. So, do we have any questions? What a beautifully apophatic response. Even your silence is a kind of language. Leo, do you have a question? Joachim, do you have a question? Look, they're doing just as well as you are right now. Okay, if there's no questions, I don't know what comes next for your focus life. Yeah, go ahead. Well, the first step is almost the impossible step. I do like the sort of idea of thinking about it as a sensibility rather than a thing you do. So instead, there are things which help create the sensibility rather than I'm doing apophaticism or something like that. Because the first step in all of the mystics is a virtuous life. Do you want to commune with God? Live a virtuous life. Like everything else is a footnote to that. So let's say you do that. Right? There are things that are a part of my tradition that aren't necessarily a part of your tradition. Contemplative prayer, such as the Jesus prayer. Not because what the Jesus prayer is, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And the repetition of that prayer over and over again, instead of what often happens when you are praying, which is you are in a constant search for what as you pray? For words. And there's nothing, don't miss out, there's nothing wrong with that. But is something being lost there as well? In terms of, I will say the Jesus prayer over and over and over. Or whatever, forget the Jesus prayer, whatever, the most basic prayer we have from the Gospels. Lord, have mercy. Lord, have mercy. The prayer of the publican. Lord, have mercy. Or let it be the Lord's Prayer. Can we all agree upon the Lord's Prayer? I don't like that one. It's the one he literally gave us, right? Or whatever it is. But in that repetition, where you are not seeking words, it's not an intellectual grasping that's going on. It's what Rob was talking about 10 this morning. It creates a stillness. It creates yes, you're using the intellect, but you are not relying upon the intellect. Your intellect is only sort of one foot. It is not both feet. So that would be, a very practical example is the Jesus prayer. I think intellectually, being involved in reading the mystics is helpful only because it's a constant reminder. In the same way, I need constant reminders to love the people that I love. I'm not a good enough person to not need those reminders. I maybe need constant reminders in this world that there is something beyond language. That there is something beyond language. And that thing that is beyond language is also beyond the language of love. That as merciful, as much as I can describe mercy, it does not actually equal the mercy of God. It is not limited to my understanding of it. And by reading the mystics, if nothing else, it is at least keeping me in that mindset as best it can. So continue to do devotion, continue to do whatever you're doing. I'm sure you're all doing a bang-up job. But I think those are sort of, and again, I would say things that are sort of within my tradition. I think the sacraments is a part of that life. I don't say that I'm there, right? Don't get me wrong. I'm going to go home today and scream at my kids for doing something that is innocent at worst. So to be like, man, he's really holy. My wife and kids are in the back. Look at them. They're talking about how unholy I am right now. If you need evidence that's not necessarily what I am, but Matt, I know you talk about this in your class in terms of what it means to live a virtuous life, right? That I am I am trying to do those things which will make me a better person. And so I'm failing in that, but at least that's the direction that I know that's the direction I should be going. That's something. Yeah. Well, we're going to get into existential Christianity because I would say like, there's not a lot of difference between those two things. So, I'm a big fan of people like Dostoevsky, and where sort of the idea of Christian being is Christian doing. I don't want to say this because you're students and you don't know enough of Christian doctrine to stop, right? So I'm trying to like remind you, cataphatic is good, but what it is, it has to be lived, and the apophatic is always pushing us to live it rather than simply know it, and that's not necessarily really a controversial statement. But think about it in terms of how it makes you even relate to other people. You guys are a part of the divine as well. You are not God, right? I hate to break it to you. Wish I had an evaluation to do right now. Said I wasn't God. You're not God, but you participate in the divine. Christ changed who you are, whether you believe that or not. Do you know what that means? It means you are outside of language, or at least part of you is outside of language as well. So guess what I can't do to you? I cannot sign what you are. I cannot give you a whole bunch of linguistic signs and say, that's who Thomas is. Thomas exceeds all of my signs. So he's like, Thomas, rude. I read your evaluation. Rude, angry, vindictive. I don't like that guy. But even if he actually was those three things, which he's not, but even if he was those three things, I would have to, because of sort of an apophatic understanding of the divine, he's more than those things. He's always more than those things. Your great sort of example of evil, Hitler, he's more than that. He's more than all of the evil things. And I can't express what he is, but he's part of the divine. He's always outside it. And glory to God if I could actually encounter all of you in the one-to-one encounter, remembering that you are not just a sort of marker, that you have a sort of infinite within you as well, because you're attached to the divine through the incarnation. And so it should even just affect not even the way we pray, but in the way I interact with someone. And I don't like this guy. What don't you like? And you just give these linguistic signs. But guess what? He's always bigger than that. The person is always more than that. You cannot successfully categorize a person. They're always outside of it. Always, always outside of it. Even how much more so the divine. I don't know if that really answers your question. My son's beating himself in the face with a paper plate. So that might be the like Zen response to this entire talk, which is just burnt, burnt, burnt. I think it's the Monty Python and the Holy Grail moment, right? So, all right, other questions? He's still doing it. Yeah, Kimberly. Yeah, I can, actually, because I looked at a map. They go up into Mexico, into northern Mexico. This is true. They've been spotted in Texas, but they don't have a consistent habitat in Texas. That's true. I have no reason to believe me, but you'll always be in a state of tension. Like, I think this is what it's like to take a class for me as well. But I'll just put it in the PowerPoint and say, I don't even know. When my wife and I were adopting our daughter, we lived apart from each other when we were going through the adoption. And I would just tell my students, like, yeah, my wife and I are separated. And they just wouldn't know what to do, because I wouldn't explain anything more. I was like, well, they are. Oh, we were. She was living in Nicaragua, and I was here teaching. And I was like, yeah, whatever. And he was like, I don't know what to trust about that guy. Rod, isn't that what you want to hear as an administrator? That like, well, the first thing is I don't know what's right and what's wrong. So how postmodern of me. Okay, so I don't know where you're going. I'll stick around if you want to talk about something, whether it be oscillates, postmodernism, or the apophatic. But may you go and actually remember that the divine is more than whatever you can contain. But so too is that other person. Okay? All right, have a good afternoon. Thanks for coming.